Professor Hugh Clegg is the Emeritus Professor of Industrial Relations at the University of Warwick, and the author of a large number of works in the field of industrial relations. He's also the co-author and subsequently the sole author of 2 volumes of the history of British trade unions since 1889, and the prospective author of a 3rd volume which is due to appear in the next 3 or 4 years. Clearly your academic career and your public career and your study of both your study of industrial relations, I think, and your study of history have revealed a consistent sympathy with, receptiveness to the trade union viewpoint and trade unionism as an organisation and a movement. Is there anything that you can, as it were, put your finger on and say why you always have been drawn to look favourably, look sympathetically upon trade unions?
It could be that I owe something to my forebears in this respect. My grandfather, my father's father, was a handloom weaver in the woolen mills. My father was a Methodist parson, but he moved from being a Lloyd George liberal during the war. He deserted Lloyd George, or he thought Lloyd George had deserted him, I think, and subsequently became a sort of mild Labour supporter, generally speaking. But I would have thought it's mainly my experience during the war. I was called up in 40 in the Oxford Bucks Light Infantry. I never put in for a commission, and nobody ever suggested that I should, I'm fair to say. I became a a radar mechanic and then a telecommunications mechanic. I can say I was 3 times a sergeant, but the last time my tapes went up, I was demobbed on the same day. But I enjoyed I enjoyed the war, so far as I personally was concerned, and I knew that the people with whom I was working were my people, and I knew that the officers up there were not my people.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably where my sympathies...
This has stayed with you, as it were, ever since.
Yes, this has stayed with me ever since, yeah.
Now, Nuffield in the 1950s, then, is developing the study of industrial relations as it were, a branch of academic research. Is there any labour history going on in Nuffield in your early years there in the early 1950s?
Well,
by others, as it were.
No, I can't. I mean, there were 1 or 2 people doing research degrees that you would call labour history. There was nobody there who was positively a labour historian until Alan Fox came to take part in the first volume of the History of British Trade Unions. He had, of course, already written a history of the Boot and Shoe Union at that stage.
G.D.H. Cole was not at Nuffield.
Well, he had a associate fellowship, and he'd taken, of course, a very strong interest in the founding of Nuffield when it was set up. When the money was given before the war and a constitution was, as it were, drawn up. But and he gave his library to Nuffield, of course.
Yes.
And he continued to be interested in the place and to help students and so forth, really up until his death.
You dedicated, in fact, one of your earlier works, the study of the general and municipal workers, to Cole.
Yes.
Had you ever discussed, or can you ever remember discussing labour history questions with him while you were at Nuffield, or while he was associated with it?
Yes, I can't remember any particular discussion, but certainly I must have. When I was an undergraduate, I was a member of what was known as the Cole Group, which met in his rooms at All Souls and talked about all sorts of topics, including labour history topics, of course. And when I wrote my first book, which was Labour Relations in London Transport, naturally I discussed that with him and so forth.
Thinking about how that phase of your career, as it were, might lead on to your subsequent work in labour history, I suppose even in that period, well, obviously in that period you were already looking at union archives and union records fairly extensively for the purpose of industrial relations work. Did you, as it were, tend to look back at earlier records as part and parcel of your interest in trade unions at that
the
stage?
main work I did on trade unions at that time was general unions, so general municipal workers, which went right back to the origin of the general municipal workers. So obviously I went back in their records to the earliest stage.
Well, can we come on now to the perhaps to the origins of the major historical work, the history of British trade unions? When was this first conceived?
It must have been round about 1955, I suppose. The warden of Nuffield, Norman Chester, thought I was getting a bit restive, and he persuaded Geoffrey Hayworth, who was a visiting fellow, and of course very influential in the among the Leverhulme trustees, to get them to make a grant, a substantial grant for the time, towards industrial relations research at Nuffield, which would allow me to expand a bit. And when we were interested in Geoffrey Hayworth's view about what he would like to see done. And he brought down Harry Briggs, who was then the industrial relations chap for Unilever. And he said, well, they were very interested in having studies of trade unions, you see, because they felt British trade unions weren't really going along quite the right lines, I think. They thought, they thought that trade union officers weren't given enough training and help and assistance and so forth. Yeah. So one of our first studies was a study of British trade union officers. But sitting down and thinking about it, if we were supposed to study trade unions, one of the obvious gaps was any serious history of British trade unions, apart from the first edition of the Webbs, which of course finishes about 1889. They did their 1920 edition, supposing to bring it up to date, but it's virtually useless. And there was very little else. Cole had never written, I wonder why he wrote a history of the Labour Party when he could have written so much better a history of British trade unions, but that was how it was. Yeah. So we thought we'd better try and fill this gap. So I got together Pat Thompson, who, as you know, was a close friend of mine, and obviously an extremely competent historian, who is very difficult to persuade him to put pen to paper. Yes. And I thought this might do the trick. And Alan Fox, who'd already been working trade union history, and together we set about Volume 1.
Did you think that the Webb's history was defective or significantly defective in other ways, as it were, or did you think it was chiefly a matter of simply incorporating more recent research and more recent findings into a history?
I've already said that the 1920 edition, purported to bring it up to date, is virtually useless. So what we're talking about, the history, the original history which they produced. Well, I think it's a magnificent piece of work, but of course a lot of it has been modified by naturally enough, by what other people have done since. But if you're going to read about the history of British trade unions in the 19th century, obviously that's the starting point. Yeah. They wrote it, of course, from the point of view of social reformers who had strong views about how people ought to behave and how organizations ought to behave. And they were very critical of the so-called new model unions, the engineers, the carpenters, and so on, for being narrow and selfish and so forth. And I would have said this shows they lacked understanding of what was involved in running unions for those sort of people at that sort of stage. But
so part of your purpose was, in a sense, therefore, to again to revise the Webb's perspective on trade unions, perhaps, as well as to simply to.
Well, we obviously had a different perspective.
Yeah. Well, perhaps I could explore that just a little. You became or were associated in a sense up to or by, I suppose, the end of the 1950s or the early 60s through your work on industrial relations with what came to be called, I don't know if when the term was invented, the Oxford School of Industrial Relations. Was that a term that you would have recognised, as it were, at that period?
Well, I think the name was coined roughly when the Oxford School moved to Warwick. But yes, there was a group of people who had been up to that time working together at Oxford who had formed views about the nature of industrial relations, views about the way in which industrial relations in this country could be improved. It was generally known as the pluralist view of industrial relations.
Mm. Well, what I wanted to ask you very tentatively, I don't know if it's a question that it's very easy to answer, is whether or how far that perspective on industrial relations, as it were, penetrated and shaped your conception of the trade union history when that came to be written.
Well, reviewers tell me it did. It did, yes. I think they're probably right, yes.
Clearly, amongst other things, the trade union history starts with a perspective favourable towards a voluntary system of industrial relations,
sure.
A voluntary system of collective bargaining, for
Correct.
example.
Yes.
And to some extent favourable, therefore, or unfavourable to government intervention,
yes.
Legislative intervention in that field.
Yeah, right.
The trade union history was intended to begin at 1889. Did you, at the outset, have a clear idea as to where it was going to stop and how it was going to develop? Or?
No, certainly not. I mean, we probably thought at that time we would be producing one rather large volume going from 1889 up to, let's say, the 1950s or whatever. But work proceeded rather slowly in terms of covering the field we had to deal with over time. And we got to a point when we said, look, we've got to produce something before long. And then we said, well, where would we cut it off? We'll cut it off in 1910.
Now, Volume 1 was a collaborative venture, as you say, between yourself, Alan Fox, and Pat Thompson, A.F. Thompson. You'd been used to collaborating before, of
yes.
course, in the field of industrial relations. Did you find this exercise in collaboration, would you say, any different from your previous experience?
Yes, it certainly was. Previously, I'd collaborated with people who were either research assistants or knew a good deal about a particular topic, but were essentially, when it came to writing a book, assisting me. And in this case, I was collaborating with two other people who rightly thought they were my equals.
Yes. How, in fact, did you divide up the work and the writing of the thing? I mean, did you each take, as it were, a given area of the research and make that your responsibility?
Yes, we did that. Of course, Pat was a political historian, so he dealt with the political side of the trade union movement, which at that time we thought included the parliamentary committee, which from its name obviously was concerned with politics. And then Alan Fox and I divided the trade union field up between us.
And what about the writing?
Well, we each wrote up our own bit.
Yeah.
But then Alan Fox and Pat Thompson had very different styles. Pat's is a very tight style, and Alan's is a more flowing style. So in the end, I got all the bits and pieces together, and as it were, rewrote. I hope this gave it a more consistent style than it would otherwise have had.
Yes. One last point, I think, about collaboration. Some of the reviews of Volume 1 suggested that collaboration made or tended to make the interpretation that you offered of trade union history rather more cautious or guarded than it might otherwise have been. That it was characterized, in other words, by a lack of one might call risky generalizations, shall we say. Do you think that is or likely to be the result of a collaborative venture of that kind? Or does it simply reflect the temperament of the three authors?
I think we were three cautious chaps.
Yeah. Just one supplementary thing further to that again, though. It has struck me perhaps about your own work that despite the opinions that you've just expressed to me, that you're not perhaps a natural controversialist in the sense that in what you've written, at least in the field of labour history, you tend not to engage directly with other labour historians with whom you might disagree. You allow, as it were, the differences of interpretation to emerge implicitly rather than to make them explicit. Is that a fair comment?
I think that's right. Heaven knows how big each volume would be if I had stopped at every corner to see who had said something different and knock him on the head if I could.
Yes.
But no, I think particularly if you're writing a general history of this sort, your job is to try to tell the story and use other people as they come in, but not pause to do battle with them.
Yeah. Thinking a bit about the reception of Volume 1, some of the reviews which I've reread in the last couple of weeks or so seemed complimentary in a slightly backhanded way, shall we say. Many of them tend to say the work is, of course, a definitive work. It must be regarded as now as the standard history and so on and so forth. And yet to express a degree of dissatisfaction or lack of enthusiasm about the product. What was your own feeling about the reception of the thing?
Since we're just talking about being cautious,
yes.
In that sense it was probably fair. It wasn't a bold and daring reassessment of the history of the British trade union movement. There was a good deal of reassessment about it, but not done in a bold and daring fashion. Yeah. So in that sense it was understandable that people should review it in this way. And I think what we thought was, well, it'll stand the test of time, and I think perhaps it has done. I
think that's quite true, yes, I think better in a sense than the reviews. But there are a couple of other points that arose from the reviews which I read, which perhaps I could try out on you by way of criticism. One was the suggestion that the work was written too much from the perspective of union head offices, and too little from the perspective of the shop floor or the local branch or the district or what have you. What would your feeling about that?
Oh, that's absolutely right. But if you're writing a history of British trade unions and you're going to pay attention to the development of the shop floor in all the industries in the country, you're going to take a long time over it.
Yes. So in a sense it was a deliberate decision.
Well, the records were mainly head office records. We must have seen some branch records and so on, but they're mainly head office records. And one had to infer what was happening down the line very largely from what head office was saying.
Yeah. And of course it would have taken a great deal more time, presumably, to try and dig up what are, by their nature, scarcer and more elusive records on other aspects.
That's right. The rank and file from time to time erupt and, demand to be heard. And one notes those occasions, but what was happening in between eruptions is rather difficult to track down.
Another criticism which you might perhaps be a little less ready to accept was the suggestion, I think, that you gave too little attention to the employers' side, as it were, of the history, and to the way in which employers' decisions and viewpoints affected trade union development. What would you say about that?
I think that's, again, a fair criticism, which I think wouldn't be levelled correctly at Volume 2. Again, it's where do you go to learn about what the employers are doing in that particular period? One has some of the records of, associations of employers, the engineering employers, the cotton employers, and this kind of thing. But in most industries, you have to search pretty hard to find anything that was very helpful. But certainly, if the history could have said, and that might have been difficult, a good deal more about employers, it would have been better for it.
Yes. One, I think, of the most interesting points that you made in Volume 1, apropos of that, was in your discussion of the impact of Taff Vale on the union movement. You argued there, I think, that at that juncture, in the early years of the 20th century, it would have been possible for employers to have made a much more, as it were, systematic attack on trade unions, and to go a lot further, as it were, towards weakening them, even eliminating them on the industrial scene, than in fact they did. Would it, in a sense, I think you leave the question there, I mean, having made that point, would it, do you think, have been possible, in retrospect, to explain why employers were inhibited or reluctant?
Yes, I think now, having taken trade union history a good deal further into along the road, one can see it's looking back what it was all about. I think employers, if they set up a system of collective bargaining with unions, get a vested interest in maintaining it. And at those periods, there'd been subsequent periods, let's say the early 30s, when employers might have chosen to try to destroy or greatly weaken trade unions. And what you find they're doing is trying to prop them up and strengthen them, because the system of collective bargaining, which they inherited from their fathers, as it were, it depends on having the unions to do their share of the work. I think that's the main reason.
Is there anything else you can now say in retrospect about Volume 1 that you might have wished to change, as it were, if you were starting over again? I wonder if, for example, to take a rather simple point, you would still think that 1910 was the appropriate point at which to leave it and to start a new volume.
Well, I think there are good excuses for stopping at 1910. There was a great eruption in the trade union movement from then on, which carried its momentum into the war and through into the immediate post-war period. So that you could argue, of course, for stopping in 1914, but that would be interrupting this particular development right in the middle. And you could have argued, of course, for taking the volume up, say, to 1920, but in the circumstances, Volume 1 might never have appeared if we had tried to do that.
Yes, well, of course, you got a whole series of public and official appointments following on the Royal Commission as arbitrator in various fields, as member of the Prices and Incomes Board. Well, what I wanted to ask you about that interlude was simply whether, out of all that experience, your general perspective on trade unions altered at all? Or in what significant ways it may have done? Did you emerge from that period with any different?
No, I came out still a confirmed pluralist in industrial relations. I still think the views expressed in the report of the Royal Commission are right. Of course, if the Royal Commission's proposals had been applied, they would have had the effect of setting British industrial relations on a quite different line from the one it's pursued since that time. And whether that would have been a good thing, of course, you can't know. But no, my views weren't changed.
Could I ask you, sort of generally, looking at the developments in the trade union movement that you studied in Volume 2, what you feel now is as it were, the most significant contribution which that volume made to looking at labour history or trade union history over that period? Is there anything that you, as it were, look back on with a certain additional pride as having been a more a significant or original contribution to the interpretation of that period?
Possibly the development of in the 20s of the features of British trade unionism, which emerged to the top during the 30s, is something which hasn't been done haven't been drawn attention to so much elsewhere, or the detail hasn't been set out to demonstrate it.
What the developments? Give me an instance, can you, of what sort of development you're thinking of?
Well, the fairly conscious decision of trade union leaders to avoid the use of strikes if they possibly could. The decision to press on regardless, pushing at government to do the sort of things they wanted, even if it was an unsympathetic, a largely unsympathetic government. And of course, given the way the economy moved in the 30s, this began to pay off, and this supported, of course, what they were doing. But I think you find the roots of the decisions that Citrine and Bevin, let us say, fairly consciously took about the way they wanted to go and how they wanted to achieve their objectives.
And of course, one of the things that, in a sense, I think seems to me quite remarkable about this period, and if I may say so, one of the areas in which I think Volume 2 makes a major contribution to our understanding of it, is the fact that even in the depths of the interwar depression, trade unionism really remained remarkably resilient and even healthy, as it were, that in some respects it went on developing, even in certain instances expanding, during a period of massive unemployment and industrial recession. There it seems to me that a reinterpretation which places emphasis on the kind of leadership that had developed in the 1920s is of considerable importance.
But of course that also refers back to what we were saying about employers and their organisation, that they were assisting in this process. They were not trying to weaken the unions at this particular point, but in fact trying to help to build up their strength.
Well, passing on now, if we may, to the future, as it were, and to the prospects for Volume 3, and this will carry the story forward to what point?
Well, I'm being a bit more ambitious here. The first two volumes covered about 20 years each, just over 20 years each. And that would give you a volume of 1934 to 1954, 1956 or something like that. which is not, you criticise some of the turning points, but that would be a pretty dreadful one.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to try and make it 1934 to 1964. Hopefully it won't have to be fattened up in relation to the larger number of years. And as it'll be certainly the last time I write on British trade union history, I fancy there will probably be an epilogue up to, say, something like 79, which will try and very briefly show how from 1964 the decline set in, which led up to the disasters for the trade union movement of the last 10 years.
Are you able to say at what point in historical time this transition occurred, and to cast any light off the cuff on why it occurred?
I think the when is under the Wilson Labour government from 64 to 69, and the two particular causes are, I think, first of all, something we've already mentioned, incomes policy. I always thought that a Labour government would have to have an incomes policy, and I believed at one time that they could successfully run one. They had two attempts at doing so under that government, and then under the subsequent Labour government with Wilson first and Callaghan thereafter, and they both turned out to be pretty disastrous failures. So that's one thing, and whether I'm right in thinking it would be, or whether I was right in thinking it would be possible to effectively run an incomes policy. I even wrote something on the subject at one time. I wouldn't like to say. I mean, maybe it'll be tested again, I don't know. But I wouldn't be too optimistic, certainly, of another attempt. And the second one is in place of strife. What would have happened if the government had said, on receiving the Royal Commission report, snap, that's what we should do. We should try and build up collective bargaining in this kind of way, so as to get rid of the various bugs like so many unofficial strikes, runaway wages systems and so forth. Whether that would have worked, we can't know. But of course the government, and particularly Wilson and Barbara Castle, decided to go for penal legislation. Obviously a tragic mistake on their part. They must have known, or they must have been very stupid not to know, that the unions wouldn't support them and that the backbench Labour Party wouldn't support them. But they went for it. And they lost their election, and they brought in a government under Heath, which was obviously going to try legislatively to purge the trade union movement of its they thought were its sicknesses. And of course the trade unions defeated them. Yes. Destroyed the legislation. And then you got a subsequent Labour government which went to the unions and said, what sort of legislation would you like to help you? And passed this whole range of legislation, make it absolutely certain that the next Conservative government come in with a well-devised, well-oiled scheme of destroying the strength of the unions through new legislation, which of course is what happened. Does that answer your question?
By and large, I think it does. The implication, of course, as I might have expected of what you say, is that you're inclined to blame the politicians for what has happened to the trade union movement, rather than to blame the trade union movement itself. Would that be a fair implication to draw from this?
In 1968-9, yes. But of course, I'm saying that a lot of mistakes were made by the subsequent Labour government. And perhaps the unions could have thought a bit before they destroyed Heath's legislation in quite the enthusiastic and destructive way that they did.
Yeah.
But the unions were, through the social contract, were equally responsible for the failures of the subsequent Labour government, first under Wilson and then under Callaghan, which led on, of course, to Margaret Thatcher's government and legislation.
Well, Hugh Clegg, thank you very much for this interview, and I must say I found it very interesting myself.
Thank you.